Well, from epic films to Supreme Court decisions, the Decalogue, as it's known, or Ten Commandments, have played a leading role in public discourse, and still are in some places. According to the writer of the book of Exodus, one of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament, and often attributed popularly, although not scholarly, to Moses, the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob, had wandered in the desert for 40 years when God appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai and gave him 2 stone tablets with 10 commandments or laws or rules or promises. The people of Israel had been slaves of the Pharaoh in Egypt after a famine had forced them to migrate there from the promised land of Canaan as refugees seeking safety and food. After a while, Pharaoh's heart was hardened against the Hebrews, the storyteller says. God called Moses and his brother Aaron to lead their people to freedom. If you want to know a short version of the rest of the story, it's printed on the insert where there are lines, if you want to take notes this morning, that tells the story of the Hebrews through the redemption in the Exodus. We hear in that story that 10 plagues fell upon Egypt before Pharaoh sent them packing after the final plague took the life of his firstborn son, his heir to the throne, apparently. Death passed over the Hebrews, and they were set free and commanded to leave Egypt. God had redeemed God's people from their bondage, a moment that is remembered each year at the celebration of the Passover feast. Of course, their path to freedom was not smooth or easy. The storyteller paints vivid images of pillars of fire chasing chariots of Pharaoh's army, parting of the sea to aid and escape, and wandering in the wilderness where they met famine once more. And only manna from heaven was their food. It's the stuff of epic movies, isn't it? The people had all but given up on the God of Moses as they starved at the foot of Mount Sinai. They quarreled with one another, dealt with one another unfairly, and turned their hearts away from the God of their ancestors. And so God called Moses up the mountain to renew the covenant that God had made with their ancestors from the beginning to be their God, and that they would be God's people, to make a great nation of their descendants, and that they would inhabit the promised land. The people, as we know from the story of the Exodus, created a golden calf while Moses was away and began to worship other gods in the hunger and homelessness that they were experiencing. For many, it appeared God had broken God's promises made to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. For some, the story of the giving of the 10 Commandments feels like God's punishment for the people's behavior while wandering in the desert for 4 decades. After all, God is portrayed as jealous and vengeful, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who would reject me. But notice here that God's mercy and steadfast love are shown to the 10,000th generation, or to the 1,000th generations, for those who love God and keep God's commandments. Do you see what the author of this story might be trying to tell us here about God's mercy versus God's punishment? 3 or 4 generations of punishment, but thousands of generations in the mercy and love of God. If this set of 10 commandments were a contract, a legal contract, we'd likely all fail miserably. I mean, I looked out here when I said, could you name the 10 commandments? And there were a lot more side-to-side shakes than there were up and downs. We would fail miserably and deserve the punishment prescribed. But perhaps this is not a contract. No, because it really is a covenant. And covenants often defy our rational, calculated, logical reward and punishment mentality. Notice God is exceedingly generous, as I just said, with God's love to the 1,000th generation, and much more reserved than any perceived punishment, 3 or 4 generations at most. It's as if the storyteller is saying that those who break the commandments will get a slap on the wrist compared to the rewards of following them completely. So what's going on here? Some would suggest that we approach this story all wrong when we equate God's agreement delivered by Moses with a contract, which has rewards and punishments. And perhaps we are more on target when we understand the 10 Commandments as 10 promises God makes with God's people. A covenant, not a contract. In Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 20, we find the context for understanding the nature of this covenant with God, known as the Mosaic covenant. Surely this commandment that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away from you. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. The writer says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, and holding fast to him, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him. For that means life for you and your ancestors and your descendants, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Embedded within the 10 Commandments are 2 great principles that God has given and to enable us to choose life over death. To choose life over death. God promises abundant life when we honor God above all else. When we recognize that God comes first. This is the foundational promise. The priority of God leads to life. God is the creator and author of eternal life. The promise of God is life when you shall have no other gods before me. When God has priority in your hearts and your minds, you choose life over death. If you think about it, if you put other gods before God, so small g gods, thinking about those things in our life that become gods to us. Maybe it's our money and our wealth, maybe it's power and prestige, maybe it's just something we love to collect, maybe it's an addiction in our life that becomes our God. When those things become God, we do anything to serve them, and it often leads to despair. It often leads to loss of relationships. It may lead to the loss of your health. It may lead to death. It's not choosing life. God promises life when we put nothing in God's place. When we worship idols, we misplace our loyalty and often our priorities at the same time. Anything that we put before our loyalty to God becomes our idol. could be our home, it could be our possessions, it could be our work or success, our favorite sports, or even our places of worship. When sanctuaries become museums instead of mission outposts to the glory of God. God promises life when we honor God's name. Not taking God's name in vain is more than simply a prohibition of cursing, by the way. God promises life when we do not do harm in God's name. When our promises in God's name are not empty. So you know when you hit your thumb with a hammer when you're trying to nail that picture to the wall and you say that vanity, right? And you thought, oh, I broke the 10 Commandments. I want to set your heart at ease for a moment. God was saying it right with you, because that's not taking the Lord's name in vain. But when you choose to exploit somebody in the name of God, when you choose to hurt somebody in the name of God, destroy the environment that God created in the name of God, then you are using the Lord's name in vain. It's not about cursing. There's nothing in this scripture that talks about cursing. It's about promising something in God's name and then not following through. I swear by God that I will ... and you don't follow through. That is using the Lord's name in vain. That is breaking the promise that you made with somebody else, that you made in God's name. In God's name. It's a much more serious consequence, don't you think? Blurting out something somewhere that's not harmful to someone. What is the consequence of that? The wall heard you? But breaking your promise to somebody that you promised in the name of God to fulfill can end somebody's life, can enslave somebody somewhere else, can destroy and harm. It's choosing death over life. God promises abundant life when we worship God faithfully by observing a Sabbath, a day of rest and gladness, worship and study, when we fast and pray, when we pause and ponder God's desire for us to choose life. When we intentionally set apart or make some holy space in our busy lives to listen for the still small voice of God. The second kind of principle that's embedded in the 10 Commandments is that God promises life when we honor one another. When we honor one another. God promises life when we honor and respect our parents and our grandparents. When we reciprocate the love we have received from those who birthed and raised us. Respect, of course, grows out of relationships based in truth, based in trust, in love, and in grace. So honor and respect must be modeled by our parents. We cannot expect, nor does God expect, children to honor and respect dishonest or abusive parents. That's not choosing life, is it? God promises life when we remember all life is valued by God and therefore is sacred before God. That killing and murder are the ways of death, no matter the circumstance. Violence only begets violence, someone once said. Killing leads to more death. Chooses death. God promises life when we honor our promises and commitments in our relationships, including our marriage relationships. When we are respectful of our social boundaries. Adultery, in biblical times, had little, if nothing, to do with vows of monogamous love, but rather the ownership of property, as wives were viewed as property of their husbands. So as in the next promises of life, when we respect another's property, we don't steal, we are honest in our dealings with one another, we don't lie, we refrain from falsely accusing one another or bearing false witness. God promises life when we keep to our promises that we make in our relationships, when we stay honest, when we are not deceitful, when we honor and respect one another in our relationships. God promises life when we recognize that our attitudes of jealousy are destructive. When we covet, I see what you have, I desire what you have, your stuff, your acceptance, your abilities, your joy, I want it, I believe I need it, so I will steal for it, I will lie and cheat for it, I will even kill for it. The choices that we make. We may not be choosing to kill for something that we think somebody else has that we now desire. But we might be willing to skim a little off of something at work to get that extra car in the driveway. We might be willing to, tell the IRS that we really didn't make that much money this year to go on that vacation in the Bermudas. It's the same principle. It's the same principle. God's top 10 promises may be simplified to 2, and Jesus did it. Right? Love God and love others as you, and you will have abundant life. This isn't a fake promise of life with wealth in material things or without health problems. Although when you don't lie, when you don't cheat, and you don't steal or kill, I will tell you this, you sleep a lot better. You have less anxiety in your life. When you're not jealous, you will have less stress in your life. When you take time for God, you will have more peace in your life. God's promise is not a health guarantee. Most of your doctors won't even do that. But God's promise certainly won't hurt you when you fulfill the other side. When we fail to honor God and one another, when we choose the ways of death over life, generations after us may reap the consequences of our choices. Broken family relationships may lead to estrangement of families. Our social fabric is polluted, and we break the world for future generations. So when God says, I put before you life and death, adversity and prosperity, choose this day life. When God says, here are my top 10 promises for you, those of you who do not follow it, you're going to be punished to the 3rd and 4th generations. Those of you that do will have life that is so exceedingly abundant, it'll be blessed for 1,000 generations. See, God says, I've put before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. Choose life. Choose life.